West Africa, early September 2002. The humid air over the Atlantic shimmered as waves brushed against the coast of Senegal, calm, rhythmic, and deceptively peaceful. The country was alive with energy. School sessions were ending, markets buzzed with traders, and the streets of Dakar were filled with music and chatter. Among the people preparing to travel south toward the Casamance region, one name inspired a quiet pride: MV Joola. She was more than a ferry, she was a symbol. A 79-meter-long vessel built by the Germans in the 1980s, gifted to Senegal, and operated by the military to connect the north and south. Two halves of a nation separated by geography and politics. To most Senegalese, La Joola wasn't just transportation, she was a bridge of unity. For years, she had carried farmers, students, soldiers, and families across the Atlantic route from Ziguinchor to Dakar. People trusted her, admired her, even loved her. Children would wave as she docked, her name painted proudly in blue across her white hull. Inside, her decks buzzed with laughter and conversation. She was seen as safe, steady, a floating piece of Senegal itself. But behind the pride lay cracks no one wanted to see. La Joola was meant to carry 580 passengers, but each journey carried more, sometimes double, even triple that number. Tickets were sold loosely, records kept poorly. Military officers, local officials, and traders all had special permissions to bring friends and cargo aboard. Over time, the rules blurred into tradition, and tradition became danger. In the first week of September, the monsoon season lingered stubbornly. The skies over the Atlantic were restless, clouds brewing, winds shifting, local fishermen warned of rough weather. But in the harbors of Ziguinchor, preparations for La Joola's next voyage continued. She had been under maintenance for months, but the delay had angered travelers desperate to return to school and business. When news spread that she was finally ready to sail again, hundreds rushed to the docks. Students carrying books, women with baskets of fruit, families clutching small children, all gathered under the humid night. Traders loaded goods, mattresses, even livestock. As the clock struck 8 p.m. on September 26, 2002, the ferry's engines rumbled to life. From a distance, it looked like a celebration. Music played from radios. Vendors shouted, selling roasted peanuts and cold drinks. Soldiers boarded with their families. Nobody questioned the crowd. Nobody checked the numbers. By the time La Joola cast off from the dock, she carried more than 1,800 people, over 3 times her legal capacity. The decks were packed tight. Corridors were filled with sleeping bags, boxes, and bodies. Many passengers found no place inside and slept out in the open, under the night sky. Some joked about the crowd. "It's always like this," a young student laughed to his friend. "We'll get there, inshallah." They had exams waiting for them in Dakar. As the ship sailed north, the sea seemed peaceful. The wind was soft, the stars bright. Families shared meals. A baby's laughter echoed across the deck. Couples leaned on the railing, watching the water sparkle. Beneath them, the ferry's old engines hummed steadily. Though a few crewmen exchanged uneasy glances, one of the stabilizers wasn't working properly. But at this point, it hardly mattered. In Senegal, La Joola was unsinkable. Out in the darkness, the ocean stretched endlessly. The Casamance coast faded behind them. On the horizon, faint lightning flickered, too far away to worry anyone. Inside, the cabins grew hot and stuffy, fans barely working. A few passengers moved up to the open deck to breathe. The smell of salt and diesel hung in the air. For a moment, time stood still. The ferry sliced through the waves like a sleeping giant, heavy but graceful. People prayed before sleeping. A woman hummed a lullaby to her child. A soldier took off his boots and watched the sea. The captain stood quietly in the bridge, eyes on the radar, unaware that this calm, this perfect stillness, was the ocean's cruel deception. Far out to the west, the storm began to grow. Winds gathered speed, clouds merged, and waves started to climb. The radio signals warned of rough conditions ahead, but no distress calls were made. The officers trusted their vessel. After all, they had faced worse weather before. By midnight, La Joola was deep into open waters, far from any port, carrying a human load more than she was ever built to bear. The air turned cold. The waves began to rise higher, gently at first, then harder. The passengers felt the ship sway, a slow rocking that lulled some to sleep and unsettled others. A young mother whispered a prayer. A sailor checked the deck ropes and frowned. The wind howled louder, but still, nobody panicked. They had faith in the ship, in the journey, in the morning that awaited them. No one aboard could have imagined that this night, calm and ordinary, would become one of the deadliest maritime disasters in modern history. By dawn, nearly every soul on that ferry would be gone, leaving behind not just a sunken ship, but a wound so deep it would scar Senegal forever. The calm before the storm had passed, and the storm was coming for them all. The clock struck 9 p.m. as the Joola glided away from the port of Ziguinchor, her hull slicing through the dark waters of the Atlantic. The warm night air buzzed with laughter, music, and chatter. For many on board, this voyage was more than a journey. It was a reunion, a return to loved ones, a chance at education, a path toward new beginnings. Children waved goodbye to the dock as the lights of the shore faded. A group of students, excited yet anxious, shared stories about life in Dakar. One of them, Fatou Diop, a 22-year-old medical student, sat by the railing with her books clutched tightly. "When I return," she said to her friend, "I'll graduate. I'll make my mother proud." Nearby, Sergeant Mbaye, a soldier in uniform, carried his little daughter on his shoulders. He had spent months away from home and smiled as the child laughed at the waves. Around them, families, traders, and travelers made themselves comfortable in the overcrowded decks. Blankets spread across the floor, luggage piled up against walls. Space was a luxury no one had. The official capacity of Joola was 580. That night, she carried over 1,800. It was chaos disguised as normalcy. Some sat atop cargo crates, others hung hammocks in the open air. Yet despite the crowding, spirits were high. A radio played local Wolof songs. Someone passed around roasted peanuts. For a few fleeting hours, life felt warm and ordinary. But deep below, in the belly of the ship, the story was different. The cargo hold overflowed with goods: rice, vehicles, construction materials, and livestock. The vessel was dangerously heavy, its balance thrown off. A few crewmen muttered concerns, but no one dared challenge the orders. The schedule was tight. The authorities wanted the ferry in Dakar by morning. The ship pressed on. The moon hid behind clouds. The sea grew darker, its calm rhythm slowly breaking. Fatou closed her eyes, unaware that the radar screens above her were already showing something, a mass of thick clouds forming in the distance. At 10:30 p.m., the first gusts hit. A few passengers chuckled, thinking it was just the ocean playing its tricks. Joola tilted slightly, then straightened. Children squealed with laughter as the wind brushed their faces. But for the captain and his officers, the smiles faded. The waves were rising faster than expected. Still, they kept going. Turning back would delay the voyage and anger officials, a risk they couldn't afford. The captain, Issa Diatta, stared into the darkness, his instincts uneasy. He had sailed this route dozens of times, but tonight felt different. The storm was moving fast, and the overloaded ferry was sluggish, almost heavy to steer. By 11 p.m., rain began to fall. Soft at first, then harder. Water splashed across the decks, drenching the sleeping passengers. Some scrambled inside, while others huddled under tarps. The wind howled across the open sea, bending the antenna masts and rattling windows. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The music stopped. The laughter faded. Fatou wrapped her shawl tightly and whispered a prayer. Nearby, Sergeant Mbaye tried to calm his crying daughter. Crewmen rushed up and down the stairs, securing hatches and tightening ropes. A sense of unease crept through the ship, subtle but growing. The ferry leaned again, this time longer than before. Cups and bottles slid across tables. Someone shouted. Then, slowly, the ship righted itself once more. People exchanged nervous glances but tried to convince themselves everything was fine. But it wasn't. The weight of the cargo, the number of passengers, and the violent sway of the sea had pushed Joola to her limits. The waves now towered above her decks. Each impact sent a deep, echoing groan through the hull, the sound of steel under strain. At 11:30 p.m., visibility dropped to nearly zero. The storm had fully arrived. Sheets of rain battered the ship. Lightning flashed across the black horizon, illuminating terrified faces for a split second before plunging them back into darkness. Below deck, water began seeping through cracks in the ventilation. Crewmen used buckets to throw it back out, shouting over the roar of the wind. The radio operator struggled to reach coastal control, but static drowned his voice. They were on their own. In the midst of chaos, human instinct took over. Mothers clutched their children. Men prayed aloud. Some passengers sang hymns, their trembling voices mixing with the thunder. Then came the moment everyone would remember. A massive wave struck from the port side. The Joola lurched violently to the right, so sharply that passengers screamed as they lost their footing. Crates and people slid across the deck in seconds. A motorbike rolled and crashed against the wall. The ship tilted and didn't recover. Panic erupted. The screams became deafening. People clawed for railings, grabbing anything they could. Fatu held onto a pipe, tears mixing with rain. The captain shouted commands, but his voice was lost to the wind. The unthinkable was happening. La Joola, the pride of Senegal, the ferry everyone trusted, was capsizing. The storm had finally claimed her. In less than 20 minutes, the ship that had carried dreams, laughter, and families began its deadly descent into the Atlantic, marking the start of a tragedy that would haunt the nation forever. The storm raged with unrelenting fury, waves slamming against La Joola like the fists of an angry god. Within minutes, what had been a ferry filled with laughter turned into a nightmare of screams, chaos, and darkness. The ship leaned dangerously to its starboard side, and for those on the upper deck, the horizon tilted until the sea and sky became one horrifying blur. Passengers stumbled and fell, their cries piercing through the roar of the wind. Luggage, crates, and people slid together in a tangled mass. Every sound, the shrieking metal, the crashing waves, the desperate prayers, merged into a single overwhelming cacophony of terror. Fatou Diop clung to a railing, her fingers raw from gripping the wet steel. Around her, people tried to stand, to run, to find their loved ones, but there was nowhere to go. A woman beside her screamed her son's name into the wind. Fatou turned, trying to help, but the next wave hit, harder, stronger, and threw her against the wall. The ship was tipping farther. It was no longer just a tilt. It was surrender. Inside the lower cabins, panic reached unbearable levels. The lights flickered, then went out completely, plunging hundreds into darkness. Water rushed in from every opening, cold and violent. People clawed at the doors, pounding, crying, begging to be let out. Some tried to climb the stairwells, but with the ship already leaning at a deadly angle, they were climbing against gravity itself. "Help! Somebody, help us!" Voices echoed through the flooding corridors, but there was no one left to answer. In the crew's quarters, orders dissolved into panic. Communication had failed. The power was gone. Some officers tried to reach lifeboats, but they were useless now. The ship's position made it impossible to launch them. On the main deck, Sergeant Mbai held his daughter tight. The child's small arms wrapped around his neck as the water crept higher. He tried to calm her with a whisper. "It's okay, my love. Papa's here." But even he knew the truth. The deck beneath his feet was slipping away. Lightning illuminated the horror for brief, haunting seconds. Hundreds of people clung to whatever they could, pipes, railings, antennas, while others slid helplessly into the Black Sea below. Every flash revealed faces twisted in fear, eyes wide with disbelief. And then, suddenly, a sound like thunder cracked through the chaos, the final groan of the ship's structure giving way. The steel hull split, and La Joola rolled completely onto her side. It happened so fast that most couldn't even scream. Those on deck were thrown into the ocean, swallowed instantly by the waves. Others, trapped inside, were crushed or drowned within seconds. The ferry had become a tomb. The ocean, merciless and vast, consumed her in silence. Within 5 minutes, the ferry disappeared beneath the surface. Over 1,800 souls were now adrift in darkness. The water was freezing. Oil and debris floated everywhere. Survivors gasped for air as they surfaced, clutching onto anything that floated. Wooden planks, life jackets, even dead bodies. The cries for help echoed across the stormy sea, faint but desperate. "Here! Please! Help!" But there was no rescue. No ships nearby, no lights in sight. Fatou surfaced, coughing, gasping for breath. The rain stung her face as she struggled to stay afloat. Her clothes dragged her down. All around her, screams faded one by one, replaced by the relentless crash of waves. She spotted a piece of debris, a door, or a plank, and clung to it with every ounce of strength left in her. Some survivors tried to form small groups, calling out to one another in the dark, trying to stay together, but the storm kept tearing them apart. The sea showed no mercy. Hours passed like eternity. The storm eased slightly, but the damage was done. Bodies floated motionless on the water. The cries were fewer now. Only the sound of the waves remained, a cruel reminder of what had just been lost. By dawn, the ocean was eerily calm again, as if nothing had happened. The sun rose over the horizon, casting golden light across a sea littered with debris and death. Fishermen from nearby villages were the first to discover the horror. From a distance, they thought it was wreckage, driftwood, maybe a capsized fishing boat. But as they drew closer, the truth unfolded in front of their eyes. Hundreds of bodies floating lifelessly, some still holding hands, others with eyes open, staring blankly at the sky. One fisherman later said, "The sea was filled with people, as far as the eye could see. It was like the ocean itself had turned into a grave." The news reached the coast hours later, but it would take much longer for the world to understand the scale of the tragedy. Radios crackled with confusion. Authorities hesitated. It seemed impossible. How could an entire ship vanish in minutes, with no distress call, no warning, no rescue? Families waited at Dakar port, watching the empty horizon. Mothers cried, fathers prayed, children clutched photographs of loved ones. But Joola would never return. It was no longer just a ferry. It was a symbol of negligence, of loss, and of a nation's broken heart. Beneath the waters of the Atlantic, the once proud ship lay silent, surrounded by the souls who had boarded her with hope, now forever bound to the ocean floor. And above, the world was only beginning to realize that what had happened that night wasn't just a tragedy. It was one of the deadliest maritime disasters in human history. The sun rose slowly over the Atlantic, casting its golden light on a scene that no one could have imagined only 12 hours earlier. The sea was calm now, deceptively calm, as if it was mocking the chaos it had unleashed the night before. Pieces of wood, plastic chairs, children's clothes, and suitcases floated silently across the endless expanse of blue. But amid this stillness were hundreds of bodies, drifting together in haunting clusters. Fishermen from the nearby Gambian coast were the first to see it. From afar, they thought it was debris, maybe a broken cargo shipment or a fishing accident. But as they drew closer, a cold dread took hold. What they saw wasn't debris. It was death, everywhere. Dozens of bodies floating face down, some clinging to each other, some still entangled in life jackets that had never been worn properly. One fisherman, a man named Lamin, later told reporters, "At first I thought it was driftwood. Then I saw a child's hand, and then another. I dropped my net and began to cry." They tried to pull as many survivors as they could onto their small boats. A handful of people were still alive, clinging to wreckage, their eyes vacant, skin burned by salt and sun. But they were too weak to speak. Many were in shock, barely able to comprehend that they were alive while thousands around them had perished. News of the disaster reached the coastal towns by mid-morning, spreading like wildfire. Families rushed to the ports, desperate for any word. Mothers screamed their children's names. Fathers clutched photographs, their hands trembling. The local radio stations began broadcasting fragmented reports. A ferry has gone missing. Hundreds feared dead, survivors being brought ashore. But the full scale of the tragedy was beyond comprehension. The Joola had been carrying over 1,800 people, soldiers, students, traders, mothers, infants, entire families, on a ship built for only 580. It was 3 times overloaded, and now most of them were gone. At Dakar's port, the scene was unbearable. As fishing boats began to arrive with survivors and bodies, the air filled with the sound of grief. Women collapsed to their knees when they recognized a familiar face. Men wailed openly, holding lifeless bodies wrapped in soaked blankets. The pier became a temporary morgue. Volunteers moved through the crowd, handing out water, comforting the inconsolable. But there was no comfort to be found. By noon, the government of Senegal had confirmed that Joola had sunk. But their announcement was cautious, almost detached. There were no clear numbers, no immediate explanations. Only confusion and silence from those who should have spoken first. Where was the Coast Guard? Why hadn't there been a distress signal? Why did it take so long for help to arrive? Questions flooded the streets as grief turned to anger. For hours after the ferry had capsized, not a single official rescue vessel had been dispatched. Survivors spent the entire night floating in the water, some dying from exhaustion, others from hypothermia, before any help reached them. It was the local fishermen, poor, untrained, and under-equipped, who became the rescuers. As the day went on, military ships finally reached the site, but it was too late. The ocean had already claimed its victims. Divers went down and returned shaking their heads. The ship was deep, lying on its side, filled with bodies. There was no hope of finding anyone alive. On land, the survivors told their stories, their voices trembling. One man, a student named Amadou, described how he had been trapped inside when the ship flipped. He had managed to crawl through a broken window, gasping for air as the ferry disappeared below. "I saw people banging on the glass, screaming," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Then, they were gone." Another woman, Mariama, spoke softly, her hands trembling as she recounted the moment she lost her children. "I held them both as the water rose. The last thing my daughter said was, 'Mama, I'm scared.' And then," her voice broke. "And then, I was alone." The images of that morning haunted the nation. Streets filled with mourning processions. Churches and mosques overflowed with prayers. Radios played sad songs in memory of the victims. The president declared 3 days of national mourning, but for the families, 3 days could never be enough. As bodies continued to wash ashore, mass graves were dug along the coastline. Identification was almost impossible. Entire families had been wiped out. No one left to claim them, no one left to remember their names. In the middle of this despair, whispers of negligence began to surface. Survivors and officials quietly admitted that Joola had been in poor condition. Its last major maintenance had been delayed. It wasn't supposed to be sailing that night. Its stability issues were known, but it sailed anyway. Why? Because delaying it would mean political embarrassment. The ferry was state-owned, operated by the Senegalese Navy. It was supposed to be the pride of the nation, a symbol of progress and unity. But behind that pride lay decades of corruption, mismanagement, and indifference. And now that pride had sunk, taking nearly 2,000 innocent lives with it. As night fell again over the coast, candles flickered in windows across Senegal. People whispered prayers for the dead. The names of the victims were still being gathered, but most would never be identified. The government promised an investigation. But in the hearts of the people, one truth was already clear. This was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made tragedy. One born of greed, carelessness, and arrogance. In the calm of that second night as the sea shimmered under the moonlight, it seemed almost peaceful again. But beneath the surface, Joola rested silently, holding the weight of a nation's sorrow, and the unanswered cries of those who never made it home. In the days following the tragedy, Senegal was a country frozen in disbelief. Newspapers struggled to find the right words. Headlines screamed, "National catastrophe," thousands feared dead, questions without answers. But beneath the headlines, one truth lingered. This wasn't just an accident. It was a disaster waiting to happen. As international aid began to pour in, and the world's media turned its cameras toward West Africa, the Senegalese government was forced to confront a nightmare of its own making. The president of Senegal at the time, Abdoulaye Wade, stood before the nation, promising answers. "We will investigate," he declared. "We will hold those responsible to account." But even as he spoke, the air was thick with skepticism. The people had heard these promises before. Behind closed doors, whispers grew louder. Joola was never seaworthy to begin with. The ship had been in service for over a decade, but maintenance was irregular, safety checks incomplete, and warnings ignored. It was originally designed to carry 580 passengers, yet it routinely sailed with over 1,000. On the night it sank, it was carrying more than 3 times its capacity. Every single level of authority, from the ferry's operators to the maritime ministry, had looked the other way. Investigators soon learned that the Joola wasn't just a ferry. It was a floating symbol of political pride. Owned by the Senegalese Navy, It was meant to showcase the government's ability to connect the southern region of Casamance with the rest of the country. Casamance had been separated by geography and decades of conflict, and the ferry was supposed to bridge that divide. But what was meant to unite the country had instead exposed its deepest flaws. When the official investigation began, international experts from France and other maritime nations joined the effort. Divers descended to the wreck, photographing the scene and recovering documents. What they found was chilling. The ship had flipped so quickly that most passengers never stood a chance. The lower decks were filled with trapped bodies, families, students, traders, all caught in the dark, unable to escape. The technical findings were devastating. The Joola was overloaded by at least 200 people. Cargo was improperly stored, adding to the instability. The ferry's design made it vulnerable to capsizing even in moderate winds, and on that night, the weather had turned rough. Not catastrophic, but enough to expose every weakness the ship had. Yet as investigators tried to piece together the truth, something darker unfolded. A pattern of obstruction. Officials hesitated to release documents. Witnesses claimed they were pressured to stay silent. Survivors who spoke to the media reported being discouraged from criticizing the state. The ship's captain, who could have explained what went wrong, was among the dead. And so the government began shaping the narrative that this was a tragic accident, an act of God. But ordinary Senegalese people refused to accept that. Across the country, protests erupted. Families of the victims gathered in front of government buildings, holding up photographs of their loved ones. "We want justice," they cried, "not condolences." Students from the University of Dakar organized vigils, demanding accountability. Civil groups questioned how a Navy-operated vessel could ignore basic safety regulations. And the international press began asking the uncomfortable questions that local journalists had long been too afraid to ask. Why did the ferry depart despite clear weather warnings? Why was it allowed to carry so many passengers? And why did the rescue operation take 17 hours to begin? The answers that emerged were infuriating. The Joola had been under political pressure to maintain its schedule. Delays were considered a failure of the administration, and so, despite warnings from the crew that the ferry was overloaded and unstable, it was ordered to sail. Inside government circles, the blame game began. The Maritime Ministry pointed to the Navy. The Navy blamed the Transport Ministry, and politicians, desperate to protect themselves, spoke of collective responsibility. A phrase that, in reality, meant no one would be held responsible. International organizations condemned the handling of the tragedy. The Red Cross and human rights groups called for transparency. Even France, the former colonial power, demanded an independent inquiry after learning that several French citizens were among the dead. But as weeks turned into months, the investigation moved slower and slower. Files disappeared, committees dissolved, and the media's attention began to fade. Still, the families refused to give up. They formed an association, Association des Familles des Victimes de Joola, to pressure the government for answers. Led by determined mothers, fathers, and widows, the group became the moral voice of a nation in mourning. They held demonstrations, marched to the presidential palace, and wrote letters to international courts. Their persistence paid off when, in 2003, a French court opened its own case, citing the French victims aboard La Joola. For a brief moment, it seemed justice might cross borders where politics could not. But even that glimmer faded. Senegal refused to cooperate, claiming the matter was an internal affair. The court's requests went unanswered. And in 2005, the French case was quietly closed, citing lack of jurisdiction. By then, more than 1,800 people were confirmed dead, making La Joola one of the deadliest maritime disasters in modern history, second only to the Titanic. But unlike the Titanic, which became a global symbol of tragedy and remembrance, La Joola slipped into silence. For the survivors and families, that silence was unbearable. Their grief was compounded by the feeling that their loved ones had been erased from history. "They didn't just die at sea," one mother said. "They were forgotten on land." The investigation, in the end, produced a long report, dozens of recommendations, and no accountability. Not a single official was charged. Not one apology from those in power. But something deeper had changed. The Senegalese people had seen behind the curtain, the corruption, the neglect, the indifference of those who ruled them. The La Joola disaster had become more than a maritime tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting the failures of an entire system. And though the government tried to close the chapter, the families refused to let the world forget. Because for them, justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about memory. In the weeks that followed the Joola disaster, the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Gambia turned into a silent graveyard. The waves that once carried fishermen and travelers now whispered the names of the lost, thousands of souls whose lives had ended in a single, merciless night. At first, the sea gave back what it had taken. Bodies began washing ashore along the beaches of Banjul, Kafountine, and Ziguinchor. Entire families lay side by side, still clinging to one another as if the ocean itself had tried to return them gently. Local villagers, many of whom had never met the victims, carried them from the surf and buried them in hurried, shallow graves. There were so many, too many to count. By the time the search operations began in earnest, it was already too late. 17 hours had passed before the first rescue boats even reached the site. Survivors later said that during those long hours, the cries for help slowly faded, one by one, until there was only the sound of the wind. For days, ships from Senegal, Gambia, and neighboring countries combed the waters. Helicopters hovered overhead, spotting debris and bodies floating among the wreckage. Life jackets, children's shoes, half-submerged crates of mangoes and cashew nuts that had once been part of the ship's cargo. Every piece of wreckage told a story, a half-finished journey, a life interrupted. But amid the chaos, one detail became painfully clear. The rescue operation had been catastrophically mishandled. Communication between the Senegalese Navy and local authorities had broken down completely. Many officers didn't even know the ship was missing until fishermen reported debris washing up on the coastline. The Joola had capsized just off the coast of Gambia, within reach of help. But bureaucracy, confusion, and fear of embarrassment paralyzed the response. By the time official rescue teams arrived, most of the passengers had already drowned. Out of more than 1,800 people aboard, only 64 survived. For the families waiting ashore, those numbers were incomprehensible. At the port of Dakar, the air was thick with desperation. Mothers clutched photographs of their sons, fathers searched for names on hastily written lists taped to the walls of hospitals and morgues. "I came every morning," one survivor's brother recalled, "and I left every night with nothing. No body, no name, just silence." It was not just the silence of grief, but the silence of a state that refused to speak. The government promised daily updates, but information came slowly, filtered through official channels, carefully worded to deflect blame. The ship's wreckage was left underwater for months, and families begged for it to be raised, to recover their loved ones' remains. Their pleas went unanswered. The silence soon grew heavier, political, deliberate, and cruel. Officials avoided the press. The Ministry of Transport stopped taking questions. Those who had once proudly shown off the ferry as a symbol of progress now avoided even saying its name. Joola had become taboo. And yet, in towns and villages across Senegal, the silence was filled by another kind of noise, the wailing of funerals that never ended. In Ziguinchor, 400 victims were buried in a mass grave. In Dakar, the central mosque overflowed with mourners. Schools closed for days. The entire country seemed to stop moving, suspended between mourning and anger. Survivors carried stories that no one wanted to hear, stories of chaos, of people crushed against railings, of mothers trying to lift their children above rising water. Many had lost everything: family, belongings, hope. And yet, the government seemed more concerned with moving on than listening. International aid agencies offered help: ships, divers, and forensic teams. But the Senegalese Navy insisted on handling the operation alone, claiming sovereignty. That decision cost hundreds more lives. And still, the sea remained silent. Beneath the waves, the wreck of Joola lay on its side just 20 meters below the surface. Divers who descended said it was like entering a tomb. Clothing still hung on cabin hooks, luggage floated inside compartments, and human remains were still visible in the darkness. One diver described it as a frozen moment in time, untouched and unbearable. The government declared that the ship would not be raised, citing cost and risk. And so it was left there, rusting beneath the ocean, a mass grave that no one could visit. Families were denied closure, denied the right to bring their loved ones home. For many Senegalese, that decision was the final betrayal. A woman named Mariama, who had lost her 2 daughters and husband in the disaster, told a journalist, "They call it a technical problem. But how can a technical problem carry so many souls? They left them there, in the dark. They left them like they never existed." Her words echoed across the nation, capturing the pain of thousands who felt abandoned, not just by fate, but by their own government. Weeks turned into months. The sea calmed again. Fishermen began returning to their roots. The waves once more carried laughter, songs, and the rhythm of daily life. But beneath that calm surface, the wreck still waited, a reminder of the night the nation drowned. And slowly, the silence of the sea began to transform. It became a symbol. For artists, it was painted in blues and grays, representing loss. For poets, it became a metaphor for the forgotten. For the families, it was sacred, a watery grave where their prayers would drift like salt and sorrow into the horizon. Every year, on the anniversary of the sinking, people would gather along the coast. They would throw flowers into the water, each bloom carrying a name, a memory, a prayer. But even as they mourned, one question haunted every ceremony, every tear, every whispered prayer. How could this have happened? Because the silence of the sea wasn't just about the dead. It was about the truth still buried beneath it. And soon, that truth would begin to surface. In the months following the Joola tragedy, whispers began to rise from the silence. They started as faint murmurs, rumors, questions, fragments of testimonies from survivors. But soon, those whispers grew into a storm that no official could contain. For a long time, the government of Senegal had blamed bad weather for the disaster. A sudden squall, they said, a tragic act of nature. But for those who had lived through that night, those words felt like an insult. There had been no storm. The skies were clear, the sea calm. What sank Joola wasn't nature, it was negligence. Investigators from France, Gambia, and independent maritime experts began digging deeper. What they found shocked even the most seasoned analysts. The ship had been built in Germany in the early 1990s, designed for short coastal journeys, not for the open Atlantic. It was supposed to carry 580 passengers. But on the night of September 26, 2002, eyewitnesses confirmed that over 1,800 people were on board. The ferry was so crowded that passengers had been sleeping on decks, staircases, and even rooftops. Cars, goods, livestock, everything had been piled on top of one another. Joola was not just overloaded, it was a floating death trap. But that was only the beginning. Documents obtained by journalists revealed that the ship had been out of service for nearly a year before the voyage. It had undergone maintenance, but the repairs were rushed, incomplete, and poorly supervised. Officials were in a hurry to resume operations because the ferry was a state-run vessel. Every canceled trip meant lost revenue and political embarrassment. In other words, Joola sailed not because it was ready, but because it was needed to appear ready. When the ferry departed from Ziguinchor that day, it was already leaning slightly to one side. Survivors later recalled that cargo had been unevenly loaded, with most of the weight concentrated on the upper decks. But no one stopped the voyage. The captain, a respected naval officer named Issa Diatta, reportedly expressed concern before leaving port. He knew the ship was dangerously overloaded, yet he was under orders. A retired engineer who had worked on the vessel told investigators, "Everyone knew it was not safe, but in Senegal, when orders come from above, you obey, even if it costs lives." As investigators pieced the evidence together, a devastating truth emerged. This was not an accident. It was the direct result of systemic corruption, negligence, and political indifference. The tragedy exposed a deeply broken system, one where safety regulations were ignored, warnings silenced, and accountability buried under bureaucracy. When the ship began to capsize that night, it took only 5 minutes to sink. 5 minutes to turn a national symbol into a mass grave. And still, those in power tried to hide behind the lie of bad weather. International outrage followed. Newspapers across the world carried headlines calling it Africa's Titanic. France demanded answers, as many victims were students and citizens with dual nationality. Human rights groups accused the Senegalese government of a cover-up. But within Senegal, justice moved slowly, painfully slowly. The official inquiry, launched weeks after the disaster, was marred by political interference. High-ranking officials refused to testify. Witnesses were intimidated. The final report concluded that the captain was primarily responsible, conveniently ignoring the state's role in overloading and mismanagement. Families of victims refused to accept that. They formed associations, marched in Dakar, and held vigils demanding the truth. Many carried photos of their loved ones chanting, "Pas d'oubli, pas de pardon," no forgetting, no forgiveness. But as months turned into years, justice began to slip away. The case was eventually dismissed by Senegalese courts. No one was convicted. Not a single government official faced trial. The captain, who had gone down with the ship, became the convenient scapegoat, the dead man who could not defend himself. For the survivors and the families of the dead, the pain of that injustice cut deeper than the ocean itself. One father, who lost his 3 children, said bitterly, "They took our children, and then they took our truth. They killed them twice, once in the water, once in silence." And yet, even in the face of this betrayal, the people refused to let the truth die. Independent journalists began uncovering more evidence, photos of the overloaded decks, maintenance records showing that the ship's stability tests were never completed, and testimonies from dock workers who had begged superiors to reduce the load before departure. Every revelation painted a picture of criminal negligence, one that went beyond human error. This was the story of a system that valued image over safety, authority over accountability, and silence over truth. Slowly, the narrative began to change. Across Africa and beyond, the Joola disaster became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of a fight for justice. It forced governments to confront questions about corruption, infrastructure, and the value of human life. International maritime organizations called for reforms. The Senegalese public demanded new safety laws, better oversight, and an end to political arrogance. And though the government tried to close the case, the people refused. Every anniversary, they returned to the shores, holding candles, telling stories, and reminding the world that behind every statistic was a human being. Children who had grown up without parents carried their photos to the water's edge. Wives who had lost husbands still came to speak their names aloud, as if the sea might one day whisper back. In the end, truth did surface, not through the courts or politicians, but through the voices of those who refused to forget. Because while the Joola now lay silent beneath the Atlantic, the truth above it had learned to breathe. And that truth would echo through history, a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't come from the powerful, but from the persistence of those they tried to silence. In the days following the Joola disaster, the world awoke to headlines that few could comprehend. Over 1,800 dead in ferry sinking, they read. But for Senegal, it was just a number. It was a national heartbreak unlike anything it had ever known. The port of Ziguinchor, once alive with laughter and music, had turned into a graveyard of silence. Families gathered along the docks, staring out at the endless blue horizon, praying for a miracle that would never come. Mothers clutched photographs of smiling children. Fathers held onto scraps of clothing, anything that still carried a memory of the ones they'd lost. Every day, more bodies washed ashore. Some were barely recognizable, swollen by the sea, wrapped in fishing nets or fragments of the ferry's wreckage. Others were never found at all, lost forever in the depths of the Atlantic. The smell of salt and decay hung in the air, mixed with the cries of thousands who had no graves to mourn at, only the ocean itself. The morgues quickly overflowed. School gyms, warehouses, even mosques were converted into makeshift identification centers. Volunteers, doctors, and soldiers worked around the clock, tagging, photographing, and logging every body they could recover. But most of the remains would never be identified. The sheer number was overwhelming. In Dakar, the capital, shock gave way to fury. People demanded answers. Radio stations were flooded with callers, teachers, students, fishermen, mothers, all asking the same question: how could this happen? At first, the government tried to contain the outrage. Press conferences spoke of unforeseen weather conditions, of heroic rescue efforts. But those words rang hollow. Everyone knew the truth, that this was not an act of nature, but an act of negligence. For many, the grief became personal when the names of the dead were published. Entire classrooms had vanished. Sports teams, choir groups, families wiped out in a single night. A generation of young people, the future of southern Senegal, gone in minutes. One teacher from Kolda sobbed as she spoke to reporters. "I lost 22 of my students. They were returning from a science fair in Dakar. They had dreams. They wanted to change this country. Now, they are all gone." The tragedy pierced every level of Senegalese society. The Joola wasn't just a ferry. It was a national lifeline connecting the Casamance region to the rest of the country. Almost every family knew someone who had been on board. The pain was collective, the loss shared. As days turned to weeks, grief turned into anger. Funerals were held without bodies. Women wept at the water's edge, throwing flowers into the sea, their only farewell. In towns across the nation, murals began to appear. Faces of the victims painted on walls, accompanied by words like "Justice pour le Joola" and "Jamais oublié," never forgotten. The government declared a period of national mourning. Flags were lowered. State officials attended ceremonies dressed in black. But for many, these gestures felt empty. People wanted accountability, not condolences. In Dakar's Independence Square, thousands gathered in protest. They carried banners demanding resignations, chanting, "Le sang de nos enfants n'est pas de l'eau." The blood of our children is not water. But amid the anger, there was also unity. Churches and mosques opened their doors to everyone, regardless of faith. Christian priests and Muslim imams prayed side by side. The tragedy had united a divided country, north and south, rich and poor, urban and rural, bound together by grief and disbelief. In villages across Casamance, time seemed to stop. The sound of drums and singing was replaced by silence. Markets were half empty. Schools shut down. Fields went untended. Everywhere there was a feeling that something irreplaceable had been lost. And yet, even in mourning, there were acts of quiet heroism. Fishermen from nearby towns risked their lives, venturing into the dangerous waters to help recover bodies. Divers searched through the wreckage with nothing but basic equipment. Many fell ill from exhaustion and infection. But they kept going, not for money or recognition, but because the dead deserved dignity. One fisherman told a journalist, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights, "The government forgot them. We will not." As the weeks passed, international aid began to pour in. France, the United Nations, and humanitarian groups offered support, both financial and logistical. But the weight of loss was something no aid could repair. Every recovered body carried a story, of a child going to school, a mother visiting family, a soldier returning home. Entire futures, extinguished in 5 minutes. Artists, writers, and musicians began to channel the nation's pain into their work. Songs were written, poems recited, plays performed. One haunting ballad that spread across Senegal carried the refrain, "The sea took them, but the sea cannot keep them." Slowly, the disaster began to shape the country's identity. It was no longer just an accident. It had become a symbol of something larger, of injustice, of forgotten lives, of a government's failure to protect its people. Even years later, the trauma lingered. Survivors struggled with nightmares and guilt. Some could not bear to go near the sea again. Others carried physical scars, burns, broken bones, but said the real wounds were the ones no doctor could see. Parents kept empty chairs at dinner tables. Children grew up with stories instead of memories. And every year, on the anniversary of the disaster, families returned to the shore. They lit candles, sang hymns, and spoke the names of their loved ones into the wind. Because in Senegal, grief was not a private emotion. It was a collective memory. The Joola disaster had etched itself into the nation's soul. And as the waves lapped gently against the coastline, there was a silent promise that even if the government forgot, the people never would. The tragedy had taken their families, but it could not take their voices. And those voices were just beginning to rise. When dawn broke over the Atlantic on September 27, 2002, the ocean was eerily calm, as if nothing had happened. But scattered across those endless waves were the few who had witnessed hell and somehow lived to tell the tale. The survivors of Joola were not supposed to be alive. Many floated for hours, clinging to planks, life jackets, even the bodies of strangers. surrounded by silence, darkness, and death. Their stories would later become fragments of a haunting mosaic, each one revealing a different angle of that terrible night. One of them was Fatou Diop, a 22-year-old university student returning home to Ziguinchor after visiting her family in Dakar. She still remembers the laughter, the songs, the smell of grilled fish on deck before the storm of chaos began. She said softly to a reporter, her eyes distant, "I remember the music stopped first, then the sound of things falling, then screams. It all happened so fast. I was below deck, trapped with hundreds of people. The lights went out. It felt like the world was turning upside down." Fatou found herself underwater, fighting for breath as the ferry rolled completely onto its side. She clawed her way toward a tiny pocket of air trapped beneath the hull. For hours she waited there, in pitch darkness, hearing only muffled cries and the faint metallic groan of the dying ship. When rescuers finally found her the next morning, she was barely conscious. "When they pulled me out," she said, "the sea was full of people, but none of them were moving." Another survivor, Mamadou Kamara, was a sailor who had served on La Joola for years. He knew the ship better than anyone. That night, he said, the ferry was dangerously overloaded, again. Trucks filled with goods, livestock, and passengers were crammed into every space. He had warned his superiors before departure, but his concerns were dismissed. They said, "It's always full and it always sails." But that night, it was too heavy, too low in the water. I felt it. When the ferry began to tilt, Mamadou tried to reach the bridge to help. But within minutes, the ship capsized completely. He was thrown into the sea, hitting debris as he surfaced. Around him, hundreds were screaming. Then suddenly, silence. He floated through the night, surrounded by the sounds of waves and the faint cries for help that grew weaker with every passing hour. "I wanted to save them," he said, voice trembling. "But I had no strength left. The sea took them from me." Then there was Awa Sek, a mother of 3, traveling with her children. She managed to hold on to her youngest son as the ship went down, but the other 2 slipped from her arms. "I screamed their names until my throat bled," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I prayed for God to take me too." Hours later, a fisherman pulled her from the water, trembling and in shock. She never saw her older sons again. In the years since, she visits the shore every anniversary, placing 3 small flowers in the water, one for each of her boys. "I survived," she says, "but part of me is still in that sea." As these testimonies emerged, they painted a chilling picture of systemic negligence. Survivors spoke of the ferry's operators ignoring weather warnings, of missing life jackets, of locked doors that trapped hundreds inside. One man described how the La Joola had left port 3 hours late, and that by the time it hit the storm, it was sailing far beyond safe limits. "We all knew something was wrong," he said. But who were we to question authority? Even more haunting was how long it took for help to arrive. Survivors claimed they floated for more than 12 hours before any official rescue appeared. It was local fishermen, not the Navy, who first reached them. "We could see the lights of ships in the distance," one man recalled, "but no one came. The night was so long, I thought the world had ended." In the months that followed, many survivors found it difficult to return to normal life. They suffered nightmares, panic attacks, and survivor's guilt. Some refused to sleep near water. Others couldn't board a boat ever again. Fatou, the student, said, "People called me lucky, but I didn't feel lucky. Why me? Why not the little girl who sat next to me? She was only 10. Many survivors also faced a painful reality: being ignored. Government officials, overwhelmed and defensive, offered little psychological or financial support. Promises of compensation were delayed or forgotten. "We gave interviews, we told our stories," said Mamadou. "But after a few months, the cameras left, and so did the help." Yet even in the face of abandonment, some survivors turned their pain into purpose. A small group formed Association des Rescapés du Joola, the Survivors Association. Their mission, to fight for justice, to ensure the victims were never forgotten, and to prevent such a tragedy from ever happening again. They organized memorials, gathered testimonies, and lobbied for an official investigation. Some traveled to France and the United Nations, demanding accountability. Their message was clear: this was not an accident. It was a crime of negligence. "We carry the voices of those who cannot speak," said Awa, during one of the association's public vigils. "And as long as we breathe, their story will not die." Over time, the survivors became living symbols of resilience. Their words carried the pain of an entire nation, but also its strength. Through documentaries, interviews, and public gatherings, their voices echoed across generations. Even today, when the sea breeze touches the shores of Senegal, many say they can still hear the whispers of that night, not as screams of fear, but as reminders of courage, memory, and truth. The survivors of Joola did not just escape death, they became witnesses to history, guardians of a tragedy the world tried to forget, and in their voices lives the conscience of a nation. In the days after the Joola disaster, as the bodies were pulled from the Atlantic and laid out in rows on the shore, the people of Senegal demanded one thing: answers. Thousands had died, families had been destroyed, entire villages were mourning. But as the initial shock faded, another, more uncomfortable truth began to surface. This wasn't just a tragedy of nature. It was a tragedy of negligence. And the question that haunted everyone was simple: who was responsible? The government moved quickly to control the narrative. Officials expressed condolences, declared national mourning, and promised investigations. The president at the time, Abdoulaye Wade, called the event a national catastrophe and vowed justice for the victims. But behind the speeches, survivors and families began to sense something familiar: silence. The wreck of Joola was left underwater, 20 meters below the surface, never officially raised. It became a watery grave for thousands. No national commission released a full public report. No senior official was arrested. And within weeks, the media's attention faded, replaced by politics and promises. Yet for the families, the wound was still wide open. Many began asking hard questions. Why was Joola allowed to sail with more than 1,800 people when its official capacity was barely 580? Why was it operating under military control instead of civilian safety regulations? Why did rescue operations take almost 18 hours to begin when hundreds were still alive, floating in the dark? At first, officials blamed the weather. Later, they blamed the captain, who conveniently had died in the sinking. It was a convenient scapegoat, one man to carry the guilt of an entire system. But survivors and maritime experts weren't satisfied. They pointed to years of corruption, neglect, and reckless overloading that had been reported long before 2002. Warnings had been issued, inspections had been skipped. One retired naval officer, speaking anonymously, told reporters, "Everyone knew Joola was a death trap, but it carried government officials, military families, and their goods. No one dared to stop it." In 2003, a year after the disaster, a Senegalese government report quietly concluded that the ferry was grossly overloaded and that the Navy and Ministry of Transport shared responsibility. But the report was never officially published in full. No prosecutions followed. By 2005, the case had effectively gone cold. For many families, that silence was unbearable, so they took the fight to another arena: France. Because among the victims were French citizens, mostly dual nationals with Senegalese heritage. Under French law, the courts had jurisdiction. The families filed a case in Paris against the Senegalese government, accusing it of manslaughter and failure to ensure passenger safety. It was a bold move, a cry for justice that crossed oceans. But in 2008, the French courts dismissed the case. The reason? State immunity. They ruled that Senegal's government could not be prosecuted in a foreign court. Once again, the door to justice slammed shut. In Senegal, public anger simmered for years. Every anniversary, hundreds gathered at the port of Ziguinchor, lighting candles, laying flowers, reading out the names of the dead. Some carried pictures of loved ones, mothers, brothers, children, frozen in time. On those days, the government would send a representative, make a speech, and promise never again. But for the families, these gestures felt hollow. One father, who had lost his wife and 2 daughters, stood before reporters and said, "They say time heals. But how can time heal when truth is buried with the ship?" The fight for accountability became a movement. Survivors and relatives formed organizations, Le Collectif des Parents des Victimes du Joola, demanding transparency, memorials, and reparations. They wanted the wreck to be raised from the sea and turned into a national monument. But the government refused, claiming the site was a mass grave and disturbing it would be disrespectful. Families argued the opposite, that the real disrespect was forgetting. "We are not asking for revenge," one mother said. "We are asking for recognition, for justice, for truth." Over time, Joola became more than a maritime disaster. It became a mirror reflecting the failures of leadership, accountability, and empathy in West Africa. In 2012, on the 10th anniversary of the tragedy, Senegal's new president, Macky Sall, announced a renewed effort to memorialize the victims. He promised a museum and scholarships in their names. But by then, many families had lost hope. Promises had been made too many times before. Even today, more than 20 years later, no one has faced trial. No official apology has ever been issued by the Senegalese state. The ship still lies beneath the waves, a silent witness to bureaucratic failure. The sea, it seems, has become the only keeper of truth. Yet amid that silence, something powerful remains: the voices of those who refuse to forget. Every year, survivors and families gather by the shore. They read the same words, carved onto a simple plaque: Joola, we remember you. And as the wind carries their voices across the water, they know the struggle for justice isn't just about one ferry. It's about dignity, about the right to be heard, about a nation's promise to its people. A promise that, one day, the dead will no longer be forgotten, and the guilty will no longer be unnamed. Because the greatest tragedy of Joola was not just that it sank, it's that justice sank with it.